The gate was closed, and the quiet marina felt normal. Until it wasn't. I never expected a simple act of locking a gate would spark a full-blown meltdown from HOA Karen, the neighbor everyone whispered about but nobody dared to confront. Within seconds, her yelling shattered the calm, echoing across the docks as if the entire neighborhood had stopped just to watch her explode. Papers flew, fists slammed on railings, and the sense of control she clung to slipped right through her fingers. I stood there, stunned, realizing this was bigger than petty rules. It was about power, pride, and who really owns the community. Would she ever stop? Life by the marina had always felt like a quiet escape from the chaos of the world. Mornings began with the gentle slap of water against the docks, the distant hum of boats, and the warm sunlight spilling across our small deck. My family and I had chosen this community for its peace, its wide, open views, and the rare sense of freedom that came from living near the water. Weekends were for barbecues with neighbors who waved politely, afternoons for fishing, and evenings for simply watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that felt almost too vivid to be real. We weren't flashy or intrusive. We kept to ourselves, maintained our property, and followed the rules. That was the understanding. Respect the space, respect the people, and enjoy what we had earned. It was simple. It was peaceful. And it worked, until Karen. HOA Karen wasn't like the others. She had a reputation that whispered through the community. Rules were never guidelines for her. They were weapons. Some called her meticulous, others controlling, but everyone agreed crossing her was never worth the trouble. At first, it was minor. Questions about lawn ornaments, complaints about parking. But there was a shift. The rules she enforced started to feel less about the community and more about control, about asserting authority where none had been asked. I tried to stay out of it. I told myself it wasn't personal, that small disputes happen in every neighborhood. But I couldn't ignore the tension building like a storm cloud over the marina. Small warnings, subtle threats, and veiled complaints hinted at something bigger. Something that would turn our quiet mornings into confrontations and peaceful evenings into battlegrounds. The first real sign came with a seemingly innocent notice taped to the gate, a new restriction, worded vaguely, threatening fines for actions most of us had never considered breaking. That was the spark. The calm of our everyday life was about to crack. And nothing about our marina would ever feel the same. The question wasn't if there would be conflict. It was how explosive it would become. The first sign of real trouble came quietly, almost innocently. A letter slipped under the door, its official seal demanding attention. At first glance, it looked mundane, another routine HOA update. But the words inside were anything but. A new rule had been added to the community guidelines, thinly veiled in bureaucratic language, warning that all gates must remain unlocked unless explicitly approved by the HOA board. Violations, they wrote, could incur hefty fines. On paper, it sounded reasonable, safety and access, but something about it felt off. The rule seemed crafted not for order, but to give Karen leverage, to let her decide who belonged and who didn't. I tried to shake it off. Surely, this was just one of those small irritations that came with shared communities. But Karen saw it differently. Within days, I began noticing her glances from across the marina, sharp and calculating. Friends who had previously waved with ease now looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact as if they feared association. One afternoon, a neighbor whispered as they passed my deck, "Be careful. Karen's been tracking who comes and goes." The words left a chill, the first real indication that this conflict wouldn't be just a paper fight. It was personal. The next week, tensions escalated quickly. I had invited a few friends over for an afternoon on the docks. Nothing extravagant, just a small gathering. Laughter echoed across the water as we watched the sun glint off the boats, and for a moment, I felt a fleeting sense of normalcy. That is, until Karen appeared. She marched down the dock with a determination that could rival any storm, her clipboard in hand, eyes narrowed as if measuring every inch of space we occupied. Without greeting, she began pointing at boats, tables, even the small cooler we'd set up, muttering about violations, unauthorized access, and common property. Her voice rose sharply, cutting through the calm air. My friends exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to leave or stand their ground. What followed was an onslaught of notices, each more aggressive than the last. One morning, I found a brightly colored flyer nailed to the community bulletin board, listing recent infractions, with my name bolded at the top. Allegations ranged from trivial, leaving a hose uncoiled, to borderline absurd, loitering on the dock without permission. Each infraction carried a fine, small at first, but the total began to mount quickly. The math was maddening. $100 here, $50 there, and suddenly, we were hundreds in the hole. It wasn't the money, it was the principle. The sense that someone, driven by petty power, could weaponize bureaucracy against me, my family, and friends. In private, I began questioning myself. Maybe I had overstepped. Maybe my gatherings were too frequent. But every time I reviewed the rules, I found no violation severe enough to justify the mounting hostility. That's when the legal gray area became clear. The HOA had created rules that were intentionally vague, with interpretations left entirely to Karen's discretion. It was like playing chess with someone who changed the rules mid-game. Every move I made became suspect. Every normal action potentially punishable. Then came the inspections. Karen, or one of her allies, would appear unannounced, clipboard in hand, scrutinizing our property from every angle. Lawn chairs were measured, umbrellas photographed. Even the alignment of potted plants came under suspicion. One afternoon, she lingered so long that my neighbors began to notice, cameras popping up to capture what they assumed would become proof of wrongdoing. The absurdity of it was infuriating. We were law-abiding residents being treated like criminals, under constant surveillance, all because Karen enjoyed the power it gave her. One particularly tense moment escalated beyond belief. It was a Friday evening, golden light streaming across the marina, when a group of guests arrived for a casual dinner on the deck. The gate, locked as usual for privacy, had always been respected by the community. Within minutes, Karen stormed down the dock, her voice rising to a roar, accusing us of violating the gate policy. She demanded names, threatened fines, and insisted that the gathering disperse immediately. Friends began packing up nervously, apologizing repeatedly, unsure if leaving meant they were conceding guilt. I felt a surge of anger. This wasn't just about the gate anymore. It was about control, pride, and the audacity of someone turning the community into their personal battlefield. By this point, the tension had begun to affect our daily lives. Every decision, when to host guests, when to step outside, even how to park, felt like walking a minefield. Karen's presence loomed, her influence creeping into every corner of the marina. I started keeping meticulous records, photos of the deck, logs of gatherings, timestamps of conversations. Every interaction became evidence. Friends and family began asking if it was worth it, if perhaps we should just comply. But something inside me refused. This was about more than a gate or fines. It was about standing up to an abuse of power, even if it meant enduring public humiliation and relentless stress. And then the complaints began to reach absurd heights. A neighbor reported that the sound of laughter from our deck violated community serenity, and another alleged that a minor spill of water near the dock was considered hazardous negligence. Each notice came with a thinly veiled threat, a promise of escalation if we didn't comply. The word, common property, became a weapon in her hands, as though the rules existed solely to humiliate and intimidate those who dared enjoy the space freely. Just when it seemed like we had reached the peak of absurdity, the tipping point arrived. Karen decided to enforce her authority in a way that no notice, no threat, no fine had yet accomplished. One morning, we arrived to find the Marina gate chain shut, a bold new sign declaring the dock off limits to anyone she deemed unauthorized. This wasn't bureaucracy anymore, it was personal. It was a challenge. It was a provocation designed to test our patience, to see if we would buckle under the relentless pressure. I stared at the sign, the chain, and the empty dock, knowing that whatever I did next would determine not just the next few days, but the entire dynamic of our neighborhood. The weight of it pressed down, the unfairness palpable, the absurdity maddening. I could feel the eyes of the community watching, neighbors whispering about what would happen next. Would I back down and accept the fines, the restrictions, the humiliation, or would I confront this head-on, risking public scrutiny and further escalation? The answer was inevitable, but the moment to act had to be precise. Every strategy, every move, every small step now carried consequences that could ignite the storm fully. And in that tension, the marina felt different. The water no longer lapped quietly against the dock. It seemed to mirror the rising anger and frustration, the brewing confrontation that was about to consume us all. The question now wasn't if Karen would explode. It was when, and whether her meltdown would finally push me to take a stand that no amount of bureaucratic intimidation could deter. Every letter, every glance, every petty fine had led to this point. And I realized that whatever happened next, there would be no going back. The morning air was thick with tension, almost electric, as I approached the marina gate. Days of mounting frustration, relentless notices, and petty harassment had built into a pressure that felt impossible to contain. The chain still hung heavy across the gate, the sign declaring the dock off limits mocking anyone who dared cross it. Karen was already there, clipboard in hand, pacing with that rigid precision she always carried, eyes darting to measure our every move. She noticed me immediately and froze, as if sensing that today would be different. I took a deep breath and walked forward, deliberately slow, letting the sound of my steps echo against the empty docks. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, some gathering at a distance, whispering nervously. Cameras flashed from balconies, capturing the scene as though anticipating history in the making. Karen raised her hand, a finger pointing like a gavel, and shouted about trespassing, violations, fines. The usual litany of threats. But this time, I didn't flinch. I didn't argue, didn't plead. I simply stared at the gate, the chain, the sign, and then back at her, letting the silence do the work. Then, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a stack of documents. Evidence of every complaint, every inspection, every violation she had ever cited against me or my family. Dated, logged, photographed, cross-referenced with the HOA's own bylaws. I laid the papers on the dock like a battlefield map, letting the wind flutter the edges. Karen's eyes widened. A flicker of something I had never seen, uncertainty. For the first time, the armor of authority she wore so meticulously faltered. I spoke, calm but firm, letting each word carry the weight of months of injustice. I pointed out that the so-called common property. Rules she wielded were selectively enforced, citing specific clauses that contradicted her actions. I presented witness accounts, photographic proof, and legal references that made it impossible to dispute the facts without acknowledging the absurdity of her conduct. The neighbors who had gathered began to murmur, tension rippling through the small crowd. Karen's voice trembled slightly as she attempted to reboot, but each challenge she made was met with another layer of irrefutable evidence. And then, the moment of escalation came. I moved toward the gate, chain in hand, letting everyone see that it was not a challenge born of bravado, but necessity, a reclaiming of our right to the property we had paid for, maintained, and respected. Karen shouted, warning of fines, legal action, even the police. But as the first few neighbors stepped closer to support me, a silent consensus seemed to pass through the crowd. The absurdity had gone too far. Karen's allies faltered, realizing that her power relied not on law, but fear. And fear, as it turned out, was not something they could project on to a determined homeowner, backed by evidence and community support. As I unlocked the chain and swung the gate open, a ripple of collective astonishment passed through the gathered spectators. The sound of the hinges snapping back into place seemed to punctuate the moment. Symbolic, almost cinematic. A turning point where the balance shifted. Karen's face flushed crimson, her authority evaporating with every step we took onto the dock. She screamed, waved her arms, and demanded recognition of her control. But her words sounded hollow, echoing over the water and swallowed by the growing sense of vindication that filled the air. I didn't yell, didn't retaliate in kind. Instead, I walked onto the dock, letting the calm steadiness of my actions contrast with her unraveling frenzy. The marina felt different now. Lighter. Freer. As if the tension that had been suffocating it for months had finally been released. Neighbors began applauding quietly, then louder, a mix of relief and celebration, their support visible and tangible. Karen's attempts to intimidate were reduced to empty gestures, her control slipping like sand through fingers. By mid-morning, the conflict had reached its peak. Notices were being shredded. Cameras captured her flailing in disbelief, and the reality settled in. The abuse of power that had dominated our lives for weeks had been confronted, documented, and exposed. Karen's meltdown, previously restrained to whispered threats and bureaucratic manipulations, was now public and undeniable. Every demand she had made, every petty complaint, every fine, was rendered impotent by the clarity of evidence and the unwavering resolve of a homeowner unwilling to back down. Even then, the tension didn't fully dissipate. Karen refused to leave the dock quietly, pacing back and forth, muttering about lawsuits and bylaws. But her words no longer carried weight. They were background noise against the tangible triumph of the residents who had witnessed the spectacle. The air was electric with a mix of disbelief, satisfaction, and anticipation. No one had expected her to unravel so completely. Yet it was happening in real time. Each step she took, each flailing gesture, reinforced the stark contrast between intimidation and true authority grounded in facts, fairness, and community respect. And yet, despite the victory, a quiet unease lingered. Karen's meltdown was complete, but her determination was not. She had been publicly humiliated. Yes, but she still existed within the HOA structure, still wielded influence over some neighbors, and still had the capacity to escalate disputes in new ways. That awareness kept me alert, reminded me that triumph in these situations was never absolute. But at that moment, standing on the reclaimed dock, seeing friends and family smiling, feeling the tension finally lift, I knew that the scales had shifted. The narrative had changed. The once untouchable HOA authority had been confronted, and, for the first time, the neighborhood saw that resistance was possible. As the sun climbed higher over the marina, sparkling off the water and glinting on the boats, I took a deep breath. The gate remained open. The dock was ours again, and the community's gaze was firmly fixed on the reality that power, when abused, could be challenged and overcome. Karen, flustered and fuming, retreated slowly, her clipboard abandoned, muttering incoherently to anyone who would listen. And in that retreat, the undeniable truth settled over the marina: change had come. But just as the echoes of victory settled, a final thought crept into my mind. The fight might have been won today, but HOA politics are never static. Rules could be rewritten, alliances could shift, and Karen, or someone like her, could return with new tactics. The question lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. Would we be ready the next time? The dock was quiet again, the tension momentarily replaced by relief and the soft lapping of water. Yet, the scene remained charged, a reminder that battles over property, control, and community are rarely simple, and that standing up to abuse takes courage, timing, and unwavering resolve. The gate was open, the victory earned, but the story was far from over. The marina was quiet the day after the confrontation. The gate remained open, the chain discarded, and the dock reclaimed by the community. But quiet did not mean complacency. In the days following Karen's meltdown, a subtle shift rippled through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact began to approach, offering nods, smiles, and even conversations that felt genuine for the first time in months. The air no longer carried the oppressive weight of surveillance and judgment. It had been replaced with cautious optimism, the sense that the balance of power had changed, however slightly. The HOA did not respond immediately. For a week, no letters arrived. No fines were levied, and no inspections took place. It was as though Karen's authority had been paused, frozen in the wake of her public humiliation. But the absence of immediate retaliation did not erase the lessons of the confrontation. Community members began sharing stories, recounting subtle abuses they had endured quietly over the years. Suddenly, my struggle was no longer isolated, it became a collective awakening, a recognition that the rules, and those who wielded them, could be questioned. Even as relief settled in, the logistics of life returned to the forefront. The dock needed maintenance, friends and family resumed visits, and weekend gatherings returned to normal rhythms. But there was a noticeable difference. Each interaction carried a newfound sense of agency. Where before I had hesitated, now I acted decisively, aware that rights, when challenged unfairly, required both vigilance and documentation. Every email, every conversation, every minor dispute was now handled with intention, recorded carefully, and framed within the context of community standards and legal clarity. This methodical approach transformed what had once been chaos into a manageable framework, giving both me and neighbors confidence that future disputes could be navigated without fear. Karen, predictably, attempted to reassert her presence in subtle ways. Notes appeared on doors, reminders about minor violations were circulated, and a few sympathetic neighbors carried rumors intended to sway opinions. Yet the impact of her public loss tempered these efforts. Conversations with neighbors revealed that her credibility had diminished. Her authority was no longer absolute, and attempts at intimidation were met with skepticism or outright dismissal. The lesson was clear. Unchecked power relies on perception as much as enforcement, and once perception shifts, authority can unravel quickly. Over the following months, a formal review of the HOA policies began, spurred in part by complaints and documentation submitted by multiple residents. The board, previously indifferent to concerns, was forced to acknowledge the flaws in its bylaws and the inconsistencies in enforcement. Ambiguous rules regarding common property, gate access, and penalties were clarified or rewritten. In effect, the community gained protections that had previously been absent, a lasting change born from what had seemed like a single, personal confrontation. More subtly, the culture of the marina shifted. Where once neighbors tiptoed around Karen's whims, now open dialogue became more common. Informal gatherings were held to discuss policies, expectations, and shared responsibilities. Residents began to understand that engagement, transparency, and accountability were tools far more effective than silence and avoidance. The incident had created a precedent, a tangible example of what could happen when someone dared to challenge authority, respectfully but firmly. Karen herself became more restrained in her actions, aware that the community had witnessed her overreach and would no longer accept unilateral control without question. On a personal level, the experience changed me in ways that went beyond the immediate conflict. I realized that standing up to intimidation requires preparation, patience, and persistence. It requires recognizing the difference between small irritations and patterns of abuse, and having the courage to act decisively when the line is crossed. The confrontation, as intense and draining as it was, instilled a sense of confidence in both myself and my family. We were no longer passive residents, but active participants in shaping the environment in which we lived. The dock, the gate, the marina, these spaces had once been arenas of tension. Now, they symbolized autonomy, fairness, and community resilience. Neighbors began to approach me with gratitude and curiosity, sharing stories of minor disputes they had endured quietly for years. These conversations reinforced the notion that what had seemed like a personal battle was actually emblematic of a larger problem: the subtle ways in which unchecked authority can erode trust, enjoyment, and a sense of safety within a community. By challenging Karen, by standing firm and presenting irrefutable evidence, we had not only protected our own rights, but had empowered others to recognize and resist similar abuses. The practical benefits of the confrontation became increasingly apparent. Weekend gatherings resumed without fear of arbitrary disruption. Dockside events were no longer shadowed by scrutiny. Children could play near the water without whispered warnings of potential violations. Boats could be moored freely. Hoses could be coiled or uncoiled without fear, and casual interactions among neighbors returned to their natural rhythm. In short, life regained its balance. What had been a tense, oppressive atmosphere was now replaced by one of cautious normalcy, reinforced by the knowledge that fairness and reason could prevail. Yet the emotional impact was equally profound. The experience forced a reevaluation of what it means to coexist within a shared space. Authority, when exercised without accountability, can become oppressive. Rules, when applied selectively, can be weaponized. And silence, when accepted as a default response, allows such patterns to persist. By confronting the situation directly, documenting every step, and remaining calm under pressure, the outcome shifted from potential resentment and defeat to empowerment and lasting change. The victory was not simply in opening a gate. It was in reclaiming dignity, setting precedent, and fostering a sense of community agency. Months later, even Karen's presence became less intimidating. While she continued to participate in HOA meetings, her influence had waned. Decisions that once reflected unilateral control now involved discussion and consensus. The community, once paralyzed by fear of retaliation, had learned that engagement and preparedness were effective tools. The tension that had once defined the Marina became a story told with a mix of disbelief and amusement, a cautionary tale of power, persistence, and the consequences of overreach. The broader lesson extended beyond the immediate neighborhood. Standing up to unfair authority, whether in a homeowner association, workplace, or public institution, is rarely comfortable. It often requires patience, careful documentation, and the courage to endure temporary discomfort for long-term results. What had started as a personal dispute became a microcosm of larger societal dynamics, the struggle between rules and fairness, control and autonomy, fear and empowerment. By acting decisively and ethically, a single person, or a small group, can effect meaningful change, even against entrenched authority. As I reflect on the experience, the Marina Gate now symbolizes more than property or access. It represents accountability, courage, and the possibility of reclaiming fairness from those who attempt to wield power without responsibility. Life at the Marina has returned to its quiet rhythm, but the memory of that confrontation lingers, a reminder that vigilance and resolve are essential in protecting both personal rights and the integrity of a community. Ultimately, the story is not just about one confrontation or one individual standing against a controlling neighbor. It is about the ripple effect that action can have. The way courage inspires awareness, how evidence tempers intimidation, and how community engagement can transform oppressive dynamics into opportunities for fairness and respect. The dock is open, the gate unlocked, but the impact of that struggle continues to resonate, shaping behaviors, policies, and attitudes long after the immediate conflict has ended. And so, the takeaway becomes clear: authority unchallenged can become tyranny, and silence often enables abuse. But thoughtful resistance, grounded in preparation, patience, and a commitment to fairness, can change the course of a community. It is a reminder that standing up is rarely easy, but it is almost always necessary. As I watch the sun set over the Marina, the water calm, once more, I wonder how many other communities are silently enduring similar pressures, unaware that the first step toward change could be as simple as speaking up, documenting facts, and refusing to accept intimidation as normal. The dock is quiet again, yet alive with possibility. The gate is open, the tension dissipated, and the community has reclaimed not just a physical space, but a sense of dignity, autonomy, and shared responsibility. The story may have begun with conflict, but it ends with empowerment, proving that fairness and courage can prevail, even in the face of absurdity, bureaucracy, and personal vendettas. And as neighbors gather, laugh, and live without fear, one undeniable truth emerges: standing up matters. And sometimes, the smallest act of defiance can create the biggest ripple.